President of the Institute for Energy and Environmental Research in Tacoma Park, Maryland. The web address is ieer.org. IEER's mission is to provide activists, policymakers, journalists, and the public with understandable and accurate scientific and technical information on energy and environmental issues. Specializing in nuclear fusion, Arjun earned his PhD from the Department of Electrical Engineering and Computer Sciences at the University of California, Berkeley in 1972. Dr. Makhijani is the author and co-author of numerous reports and books on energy and environment-related issues. He has done extensive work on nuclear and renewable energy, as well as on the health and environmental impacts of nuclear weapons production and testing. He has served on national and international advisory groups and committees, including from 2021 to 2023, being a member of the panel of independent global experts on nuclear issues, appointed by the Pacific Island Forum to address concerns about the ocean dumping of radionuclides from the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear reactors in Japan. His curriculum vitae includes a partial list of his publications totaling some 176 entries. In 1974, he was one of many co-authors of a Ford Foundation energy policy project titled A Time to Choose, America's Energy Future, one of the first attempts to develop a national energy plan. In 2007, Dr. Makhijani published Carbon-Free, Nuclear-Free, a roadmap for U.S. energy policy. Assuming existing technologies, this book gives a detailed analysis of how we can phase out of fossil fuels and nuclear power while maintaining our existing lifestyle. In 2016, Dr. Makhijani authored an energy roadmap for the state of Maryland titled Prosperous Renewable Maryland, Roadmap for a Healthy, Economical, and Equitable Energy Future. The attributes of the roadmap are to be essentially emissions-free, reasonable in cost, just and equitable, robust and resilient, and democratized. More recently, in 2023, Dr. Makhijani published the book Exploring Tritium Dangers, Health and Ecosystem Risks of Internally Incorporated Radionuclides. Thank you for being with us today, Dr. Makhijani.
Thank you, Alfred. I had never actually counted up all publications there. Yeah, just if there's one more that's worth it, I just add it and let it be at that. Thank you. That's a lot of writing. Anyway, maybe I ought to stop. Can I share my screen? Okay, let's see. There we go. Let me try to put that in presentation mode. It doesn't want to go into presentation mode. There. All right. Thank you very much for inviting me. I have worked with PSR Wisconsin off and on, have many good friends in Madison. And so it's a pleasure to be back, invited by PSR Wisconsin to speak to you. So I'm going to give you a survey of security and health issues. Security is something that's not often considered in this context. And at the end, I'll also give you a brief note on the climate question, but I'm focusing on these two things. So this is the schematic of a pressurized water reactor, just to set the stage for where we're headed. Alfred, will you kind of interrupt me and give me a 5-minute or 10-minute note when I have 10 minutes left? So there are two kinds of reactors here in the United States: power reactors, pressurized water, boiling water. This is a pressurized water reactor. I think you can see my cursor. This is the reactor here, and it doesn't boil in the reactor, the water. It's high pressure water, and it boils in a separate heat exchanger called steam generator, and then runs the turbine. It's condensed in this device called a condenser. And this water comes from a river or lake or the ocean. And like coal-fired power plants, nuclear power is extremely water intensive. I'm not going to dwell on that. A very, very big resource issue. But I just do at least want to mention it. This is an NRC. You'll get these slides, and some of the references are in the notes section, and you'll be able to see this is an NRC, Nuclear Regulatory Commission diagram. Okay, so these are the technical characteristics of a typical reference size reactor. They're a little more or less than 1,000 megawatts today in the US. US, I think, has, what, 92 or 96 nuclear power plants, roughly this size, operating. It had 110 odd at one time. The annual generation from such a reactor would be about 8 million megawatt hours. That's enough for about 500,000 all-electric households, maybe 800,000 to 1 million non-electric households, meaning electric households with electricity but heated by oil or gas or wood. So there are low to no on-site carbon emissions. This is a point of controversy in the anti-nuclear community, but it shouldn't be. This has been carefully worked by many independent people, including construction, mining, and all that, uranium enrichment. Has roughly the same CO2 emissions as utility scale wind. It takes energy to make solar panels and wind turbines and erect them. The big difference, or one of the big differences, is that wind and solar don't need fuel. Mother Nature provides the fuel, but nuclear reactors, of course, need uranium mining, and I'll talk some more about that. So the amount of waste at the reactor every year is quite small, 20 metric tons per year. This is something that nuclear power advocates like to talk about quite a lot. But it's not like your coal ash, which is, in the hundreds of thousands of millions of tons, and it's a huge problem. There are coal ash ponds all over the country and in other countries, and that is a huge environmental issue as well. Now, 20 metric tons is not a lot. Compact volume is stored on site, but it has 900 kilograms of highly radioactive fission products, some of which are very long-lived, and about 200 kilograms of plutonium. That's per year. Now, to make that 20 metric tons, you have to enrich the uranium to about 4%. That's what we do currently, maybe a little more. 120 metric tons of uranium wind up as depleted uranium. What that means is natural uranium has just 0.7% uranium-235, which is the fissile component, and 99.3% uranium-238, there's a trace uranium-234. And so if you want more U-235, you enrich that part, and then you wind up with a depleted part, which is waste. And so for every ton of fuel, you get, depending on the enrichment, 6.5 tons of depleted uranium, and then there's some other waste along the way in the processing. To get that much uranium, so about 140 tons of uranium pure, you need you're going to create about 2,000 to 20,000 metric tons of mill tailings, because that's how much ore you need. Uranium is a trace metal in ore. And then there's also a large amount of uranium mine waste, a similar amount, so far completely essentially unregulated. And I'll mention that too. Uranium is both a radioactive and heavy metal toxin. So it's not like plutonium in that. Plutonium is 200,000 times more radioactive. Oh, am I saying that right? Plutonium is 200,000 times more radioactive than depleted uranium, and about 100,000 times more radioactive per gram natural uranium. So by the time you get enough plutonium to give you a big dose of radiation, it's still a small amount of metal. But uranium is in that place where its half-life is long enough, so you have to breathe in or ingest a fair amount. to give you a similar dose of radiation. And by that time, it's also heavy metal toxic, kidneys mainly. Both uranium and plutonium go to the bone and affect other organs as well. So let me frame the security issue. So let me go back here and emphasize this is the nuclear part of the power plant. Everything to the right of this is just like a coal-fired power plant or a gas boiler power plant. So this replaces the coal boiler. So all we're doing with a nuclear reactor is boiling water. We are making 20 to 40 Nagasaki bombs, depending on how sophisticated the maker is. I use a figure of 30 normally, or 25 is pretty good too. That's what the IAEA would say. We're basically making plutonium to boil water along with the fission products. So over 30 years at a 2-reactor site, which is fairly typical of reactor sites, we have accumulated about 1,500 Nagasaki-sized bombs at 8 kilograms per bomb. That's the figure that IAEA uses as a significant amount of plutonium, because, in terms of safeguards and verification of facilities. So here are some overall perspectives. We have about 100,000 Nagasaki-sized bomb equivalent of plutonium in US spent fuel alone. Of course, it needs to be separated from the spent fuel. It's about 1% of spent fuel. And that is not an easy thing to do. So it's not an easy thing to make bombs out of this. But globally, it has been done, mainly in France, Britain, Japan, Russia, India, much less in the United States. We have about twice as much surplus separated weapons usable plutonium in the civilian sector as there is in all the nuclear weapons stocks in all nuclear weapon states. The largest part of the stock is in Britain. It's entirely surplus, not being used, and becoming less usable every day because of the peculiar radioactive properties of the mix of uranium isotopes that are part of this. Second largest is in France. Britain and France are also holding some plutonium for Japan. Japan is the only non-nuclear weapon state with a large amount of plutonium, both in Japan and held by Britain and France. There has, you may be aware, been lively debate from time to time in Japan about whether they're going to make nuclear weapons. Before they signed the NPT, there was debate. There was a document, and I've published and written about this. It might be one of those references that Alfred mentioned, that basically, should Japan become a nuclear weapons state or rely on the United States? And they said, well, it's a cost-benefit calculation. For now, we'll sign. That was the spirit. This is not an actual quote. That was the spirit of the document. This is an official parliamentary debate document, if I'm remembering correctly. Currently, as you probably know, the largest nuclear power plant in Europe, Zaporizhia in Ukraine, which has 6 reactors, is in a war zone. A single nuclear weapon on such a plant would render a pretty large country uninhabitable. Already, we know from a much smaller nuclear event, accident like Ukraine, which is in the same country, the impact was disastrous in Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, and many countries, several countries in Europe. In the midst of all this, I find it surreal that U.S. company Holtec has signed a contract with the state-owned nuclear power company in Ukraine, the state of Ukraine, basically, I think that should be 20, not 30. I'm sorry. I will correct that before I send it. This is how, at first, spent fuel is stored in. So the security of spent fuel is a big deal. because it contains all this weapons usable material. If separated, so you don't want it to be separated. In the US, there's no commercial separation. There's no separation for weapons also going on. This US and Russia have lots of surplus weapons, plutonium, from dismantled weapons. This is how it's stored. This is not the very best casks, I can assure you. It's a different debate, but this is how it's stored in dry casks after a few years of storage in wet pools. It has to be stored in wet pools because there's a lot of radioactivity per ton in spent fuel when it comes out of the reactor first, and it would have a meltdown if it were not cooled by water. And so there's a fair amount of spent fuel and spent fuel pools in the United States. It's allowed to be densely stored, making it more risky if there's a loss of coolant. So not only reactors can have a loss of coolant accident, spent fuel pools can also have a loss of coolant accident. In most ways, this is somewhat safer than spent fuel pools, but you can't put it in dry casks right away because you have to cool it for several years. Now, what about the long term? So plutonium has a half-life of 24,000 years. Of course, you can make weapons if you separate the plutonium. We're not doing that. It's the United States discourages countries that don't have plutonium from reprocessing, even though that's their quote unquote inalienable right under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, Article 4. So currently, so this is about the United States, spent fuel is mainly stored on site with some exceptions. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission made a very bizarre ruling, in my opinion, and that is obviously an opinion, that the government will be there to ensure the security of storage of spent fuel forever, thousands of years, tens of thousands of years. And that this obviously requires funding for security each year. And every 100 years, you have to swap out those casks because, you know, rain and snow and the wind will erode concrete, and you might have to replace. So every 100 years, you'll have to roughly, give or take, you'll have to have more money to replace all of that. And you have to have the facilities to swap out the casks, the storage containers. The Nuclear Waste Policy Act in 1982 thought that long-term storage was not a good idea. I agree with that. There's nothing good to do. There's no good solution for spent fuel. The least bad solution is to have an engineered deep geologic repository of some kind, and to make it as secure as possible, and dispose it off because it's too risky. Why is it so risky to store it on site? The spent fuel is currently very radioactive externally, not just radionuclides inside it that could poison you if you break it open, but there's external radiation, you know, like gamma radiation, and cesium-137 is the only one with hard gamma radiation that prevents relatively easy theft. That is, it prevents somebody from approaching the spent fuel and not being killed by that radiation. So currently there's a kind of a radiation barrier to extraction of plutonium, but cesium-137 has a half-life of 30 years about. And so after 200 or 300 years, this radiation barrier will be gone. The current state of the spent fuel is called the spent fuel standard by the national academies because it's a very, you know, almost very secure means of storage because third parties cannot easily handle it and extract the plutonium. But what happens after 200 or 300 years? The radiation barrier is gone. If the government is not there after 200, or if the government is not there at the site, it could be in Washington, then the surveillance will be gone. I'll give you an example of loss of institutional memory. During World War I, the Army had chemical weapons research at the site where near where American University is today on Massachusetts Avenue, a very relatively fancy neighborhood in Washington, D.C. I was struggling for the words there that might be appropriate. And there were chemical weapons residues, drums of highly toxic waste that were buried. And within a few decades, there was a total loss of memory in institutional memory. Fancy houses were built, children are playing in these areas, and was discovered in the 1980s. And there was a cover-up for many years until it became a terrible scandal and followed by cleanup. So we're not talking 200 or 300 years now. We're talking Washington, D.C. in a fancy neighborhood, less than 100 years. In the NRC's own low-level nuclear waste rules, it says you must not assume institutional control for more than 500 years. And so when sued that you should do something about the spent fuel and not allow production of more, implicitly, the NRC simply said that the government will be there not to worry. It can be stored on site forever, and the funding will be there, and it's improbable to assume and unreasonable to assume the government will not be there. In a country that had within 300 years, it did not exist 300 years ago, there was a war at its founding, and there was a war, 90 years after its founding, not that long ago in this kind of time frame, certainly less than 200 years. None of this was taken into account. So there are some aspects of security in the nuclear business, even though it is so dangerous and involves the most dangerous materials from a security point of view, that are, I think, unreasonable and, in my opinion, surreal. And I'll give you another surreal example, because this is very little discussed. So if we have a repository, and I think we should have one that is science-based, and that's a whole other debate. You can ask me a question about what that means. There has been general agreement that we should leave a message, and there's been a debate about what language it might be in, because that message has to last for 10,000 years, sort of like the debates we have about if we send a message to other people in space, how should we write it, if there are other people in space. And I once made a presentation to the National Academy's panel on this question, on waste, on spent fuel repositories. And I said, we've skipped a couple of steps. Suppose you succeed in clearly communicating a message that there's dangerous radioactive stuff down there, spent fuel. And it will then be understood. We're going to put this in a remote area, and you have an assumption that everybody who reads it will be good. And there's absolutely no basis in human history to assume that. Many of us are good, all of us are good to some extent. I happen to believe that we're all mixtures of some good and bad, and some people have more of one and some others have more of the other. Now, if somebody wants plutonium, they're going to read that message, understand it, go down. Now it's a remote area, not being surveilled, loss of institutional memory. Perhaps we should not leave a message and not put this in a remote area. There was an august panel of very well-experienced PhDs in the room, and none of them had thought about this and was stunned. This is not to denigrate anybody. It's just to give you an idea of how complicated this issue is and how some of the most obvious things in terms of human nature, it's difficult to think about the interaction of those with this kind of material for these kinds of periods of time at the level of security risks that it presents. And I don't need to tell PSR about the kinds of damage that nuclear weapons can do. All right, some environmental aspects, obviously related to health aspects. So I talked about a 2-reactor power plant. How much cesium does it have? It has about 4 times about of the cesium inventory of all the cesium-137 released during all atmospheric tests by all testing countries. That's at one site, one 2-reactor sites, 1,000-megawatt reactors. About 1.5% of this release, if there were an accident or Zaporizhia, if the plant were bombed, a very small fraction of this would equal the Chernobyl accident release, which was, by all accounts, the most disastrous accident. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about accidents, but I presume that you know about them, and the damage to health and the environment has been significant of the worst accident, especially Chernobyl. And we have accumulated more than 200 million metric tons of mill tailings, mostly in the Colorado Plateau, but also in several other states, and about a similar amount of uranium mine waste. There are hundreds of abandoned mines in the Navajo Nation alone, mostly unremediated, houses built out of uranium mine waste, radioactive, high radon in the houses. Now, another bizarre part, and I'm sorry to use these kinds of words that are not common in scientific discourse, but this is not a thing that is common in the world of science. So I've looked into why liners under mill tailings to protect the groundwater are regulated to last for 1,000 years. Because the half-life of thorium is 75,000 years, and that's the parent material of radium-226. So mill tailings will have radium, significant amounts of radium in them for hundreds of thousands of years. So 1,000 years doesn't make any sense. It's an arbitrary kind of number designed to look big, sort of like the half-life of radium, but has no relationship to the actual long-term danger of the mill tailings themselves to the groundwater, which will last for hundreds of thousands of years. We have had not only no answer, but no discussion about how we're going to protect future generations from this kind of stuff, from this level of magnitude of waste. And the US is now exporting this problem, has been exporting this problem for a long time, because it imports more than 80% of the uranium that is used in US reactors, and has done for many years. So currently, the few mines there are, a couple, I think, I don't remember how many mines there are. Uranium is solution mine, which is a strong base or acid is put into the ground in an ore body, and the uranium solution is brought up. Of course, it has a lot of other toxic materials and radium and so on as well. Now you're mobilizing all that. And the country, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, EPA, allowed the re-injection of this toxic liquid, which is now mobilized with toxic heavy metals and re-injected. We're polluting aquifers and compromising large amounts of groundwater by these practices, even though importing most of the uranium. Yeah, so this is a uranium mine, a surface mine. This is mine leaking into the water. These are depleted uranium cylinders. They contain uranium hexafluoride. Of course, some of the hexafluoride reacts with the moisture, from hydrofluoric acid. That's inside. This is the rust, just metal contact with moisture. Over the decades, we have 500,000 tons of this stuff in 3 sites in Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee. Okay, that's a little bit of a survey, and I'll spend the rest of my time on health. I think I've got about 10, 15 minutes to go. So this is data from the National Academy's 2006 BR7 report that we compiled. We used to do technical training workshops a long time ago, and I think soon after the BR7 committee published their report, we did one on health. The vertical axis is cancers excess cancers among 100,000 people exposed to a one-time 0.1 gray or 10 rem dose. And as you can see, females are much more at risk, especially at younger ages, that the risk differential declines with age. And children are much more at risk than adults. So adults being here 30 were somewhere near the average risk is about 1,000 excess cancers if you average it overall. But for adults, it's about here. You can say adult males using as a reference, as is often done, 1,000 excess cancers if 100,000 population gets a 10 Ren dose. And infants getting the same dose would be nearly 5 times that much. Boy infants getting that dose will be 2.5 times that much. And females generally remain at higher risk. Now, this is all cancers put together. It's not true of every single cancer. So there are some cancers, I forget which ones. It's in the Beer 7 report. And I will put up a reference to Science for the Vulnerable from where we compiled this graph and published kind of a discourse on radiation protection and health and standards and so on. During the chat period, or I'll put it in one of the slides so you'll have it as a reference. And it'll give you a lot of other references as well. So how do we assess radiation risk? Most radiation risk, as you know, is focused on cancer. This happened during the Manhattan Project. They had to make sure that basically people were healthy enough to come back to work every day. Now, this involves, of course, the normal industrial safety, all unusually involved radiation safety. So they had to figure out some metrics. And since it was dominated by physicists, they had a very physics type of measure. They said, well, mostly water. Well, fetuses are 80–90% water. Women have slightly more water than men, if I'm remembering correctly. I think full adults may have 60% water, males. So not a bad approximation to treat the body as a bag of water. We're putting ionizing radiation in it. It has a certain number of ionizations. We're dumping energy in the body and disrupting it, creating DNA strand breaks. And that came later, of course. But it was the inspiration of Erwin Schrödinger, actually, that led to the DNA research. And he wrote a little monograph called What is Life? That's a little side note for you. Very worthwhile reading. And he kind of inferred that there must be something like DNA. And so then, of course, we know that if we have uranium or plutonium inside the body, it has alpha radiation, which is helium ions. And helium ions are, thousands of times more massive than electrons, which is beta radiation, and then photons, certainly. And so the track of their damage inside a cell is much smaller. It's called high linear energy transfer radiation. And so it's producing high density of damage that has less chance of repair in the cell if it's inside the body as an alpha particle. And I would also argue if it's inside the body as, say, like tritium, which is a low energy beta emitter, beta emission being electrons or positrons. And so they assigned what they call a relative biological effectiveness to this kind of radiation. And for regulatory purposes, you multiply gamma radiation by 20, you multiply the energy deposited by 20 and say, well, this represents a risk-based dose. It's not actually a dose. It's a notional number created out of a dose that represents risk, but really represents only cancer risk. It doesn't work too badly, I think, if used properly, but it's not for all kinds of damage and not for pregnancy, not for fetal health, and probably not for infant health in many ways. And certain kinds of genetic damage is hundreds of times that of gamma radiation from internal alpha radiation. And some non-clonal aberrations occur only with internal alpha radiation, but not external radiation. So relative biological effect, now you have to multiply gamma radiation deposition by infinity. So it doesn't make sense from any numerical or regulatory point of view. There are also bystander effects. That means if cell A is irradiated, and in one peer-reviewed public, you'll find these references in my tritium book, which Alfred mentioned. 30 cells were impacted genetically, even though they were not directly impacted by the radiation. And if I recall correctly, these were ova in some mammal, experimental mammal, of cells over from some experimental mammal. So, as you know, we have lots of mitochondrial DNA, hundreds to thousands in every cell. Internal radiation damages mitochondrial DNA. External also damages mitochondrial DNA, but when it's all dumped in a cell, the mitochondrial DNA, we have had almost no regulation that I know of anyway, that is based on serious consideration of the damage to mitochondrial DNA, which doesn't have powerful repair mechanisms, unlike the nuclear DNA. And the result is that we have a radiation protection system that is seriously deficient so far as reproductive issues is concerned. And as you know, mitochondrial DNA is the common energy system of all eukaryotes. I think there's one exception, if I'm remembering correctly. So whether it's a plant or a fungus or a mammal or animal or an insect, we all have mitochondrial DNA as the center of our energy systems. And yet, even though radiation creates oxidative stress in the cytoplasm, this has not been a consideration although it's in the literature, in radiation protection. And I'll talk more about radiation protection during pregnancy. Let me move to that topic. So radionuclides cross the placenta. These are just a few examples from things I've talked about. Cesium and strontium also cross the placenta. Iodine, of course, also radioiodines would cross the placenta. An important thing to remember is that internal intakes that create residues of radioactivity that haven't been kind of evacuated by urinary or digestive processes remain in the body. Insoluble uranium and plutonium can remain in the body essentially for a lifetime if it's highly insoluble and it targets certain organs. Also crosses the placenta. So if taken in prior to pregnancy, it will affect the fetus, and taken in during the pregnancy, it will affect the fetus. Essentially the same, as you can see. There's a difference for plutonium where the impact on the fetus depends, I believe these three numbers are solubility related numbers. I'm not quite sure, I don't remember actually, but there are three different solubilities of plutonium that would impact the fetus differently in terms of transfer via the placenta. Americium is a decay product of plutonium-241, americium-241. It's a very important radionuclide environmentally and from a health point of view. I'm going to focus the rest of my talk on tritium because tritium is the most ubiquitous nuclear pollutant, both from weapons and power. Tritium is radioactive hydrogen, as you know. And when combined, when displaces one or both of the H's in H2O, you get radioactive water. 1 teaspoon, about 5 grams of HTO, tritiated water, would contaminate 100 billion gallons of water to the drinking water standard in the United States of 20,000 picocuries per liter. This yes, go ahead.
Just your 10 minutes from the end of your talk.
Oh, thank you.
Your-
I thought I had 5 minutes more. Are we ending at 10?
Yes, we'd like to have some time for questions
Yeah,
too.
right, absolutely. I'll end in about 5, 7 minutes. So this gives you a little chart of, it shows you that basically all reactors are emitting some amount of tritium, and they actually emit tritium from evaporation from the spent fuel pools as well. Tritium is made during the process of fission, tertiary fission, and there are 3 fission products. In pressurized water reactors, it's also made within the water that is used for cooling in the pressurized water vessel, because boron is added to control the chain reaction in those kinds of reactors. So these are numbers from 2007. So treated water being water, it basically circulates like water both inside the body and in the ecosystem. And this is from the French research of governmental agency that does research on radio protection. It's a very good chart. I think you can, look at it more closely when you get these slides. So of course, us being water is very important, because now if we are drinking water, and we're allowed to drink water up to 20,000 picocuries per, and the cancer risk from 20,000 picocuries is about 1 millirem per year. So as things go, not big. It's about, let's see, the cancer risk of cancer is about 1 cancer per 0.1 cancer per sievert. So 0.1 cancer per 100 rem. So one cancer per 1,000 rem. So 1 millirem, yeah. So you're talking, 1 in 100,000 risk. So small. I will check my math and correct it if I didn't do it correctly this early in the morning. Not normal for me. But what happens in the cell is oxidative stress. You have tritium in the cytoplasm. It's mostly water. And the water is ionized. And what you get are hydroxyl radicals. Hydroxyl radicals are, as you know, extremely chemically reactive. They create excess reactive oxidative stress. They damage the mitochondrial DNA and damage the energy system. Now, the same thing occurs in all living beings. And so when we dump tritium into the environment, for example, the Savannah River has had something like 1,000 picocuries per liter in the river, 100 miles upstream from Hilton Head, with significant amounts of tritium all the way to Hilton Head. And the good people of Hilton Head who have been drinking that water for some time, I don't believe most of them are aware that they're drinking water from, unusually, from a combined radioactive pollution of weapons and nuclear power production, because the nuclear reactors at about the same place in Georgia as there is a nuclear weapon site in the South Carolina side of the river, about 100 odd miles upstream. So here are the risks we're not thinking about, or certainly not regulated: early failed pregnancies, failure to implant, problems with the blastocyst period, then during organ formation, malformations. A very particular damage that has been documented from Hiroshima and Nagasaki data is what the International Commission, ICRP, calls severe mental retardation. That is a term that was used then. This is from the 1980s. Defined as an individual unable to form simple sentences, to solve simple problems in arithmetic, to care for himself or herself, and is or was unmanageable or institutionalized. There was a statistically significant risk among women who were pregnant at the time, and where they survived and their babies survived, to be delivered and be old enough to be part of this, basically the health surveillance that was put in place starting in 1950. For five years, there was no systematic. So most of the vulnerable who were most affected would have, those who died from the bombings, not directly at the time of the bombings, they are not part of the cancer risk or other statistics because the systematic study only started in 1950. Alice Stewart was quite upset about this, but no, she was a great scientist, and there were some of us who did listen to her. She was the first one to warn about X-rays during pregnancy. Ova and sperm damage create multi-generational risks. I sometimes ask people, how old are you? And they tell me their age. And I said, no, half of you is as old as your mother, because the ovum from which you were created was created in your mother when she was in her mother's womb. And thereby try to convey a lesson on radiation protection via an amusing but essential biological fact. So we're not regulating for reproductive risks. We're not regulating this particular radionuclide adequately. That's why I wrote a whole book about it, because the most ubiquitous one, we're releasing it routinely. We don't know that we're making radioactive rain. There was an icicle at a nuclear power plant in New Jersey that had tritium in it in the millions of picocuries per liter compared to the so we have actual evidence that some radioactive rain is very, very radioactive. Most of it is not, because it's diluted, depends on weather patterns, the nature of the rainstorm, how much of it comes down in the neighborhood, all that. So there is evidence of reproductive risks in other creatures, and should not be a surprise, because we have not that different, vertebrates have not that different reproductive systems, some, inside the body, some outside the body, but, some creatures develop outside the body and some inside the body, and some, anyway. So this is an experiment that was, this is research that was done in Russia, I think the post-Soviet period, that found that fish eggs were damaged by levels of tritium in the water that are at about 2/3 of the level of the US drinking water standard. And yet there's no actual serious regulation to protect ecosystems, to protect the reproductive systems. And this was part of our argument that Japan should not be dumping tritium into the Pacific Ocean. They'll be dumping about 3 grams of tritium over 30 years. And I mentioned that doesn't sound like a lot, but as I told you, tritium is extremely radioactive, nearly 10,000 curies per gram. And so 3 grams achieves quite a different. And Los Alamos, where of course the bombs, Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs were made, is currently proposing to vent a maximum of 9 grams of tritium in a matter of days from waste containers. And I have been working with some people in the pueblos near there to try to stop them from doing that, or at least consider better alternatives for managing that waste. There are no formal dose limits for ecosystems. I think we have created significant damage in ecosystems. There's actual biological evidence of this in the Chernobyl exclusion zone that is published in the literature. An example of how we're not protecting fetuses and infants in pregnancy. The only protection is during pregnancy if it's declared, like if you're working in Los Alamos or a nuclear power plant, it's 500 millirem during the pregnancy, declared pregnancy. Other OECD countries have 100 millirem. This is grossly inadequate. Pregnant members of the public are not protected at all. Despite all the talk about pregnancy and, when life begins, all those controversies, I think it is to be noted that pregnant members of the public are not protected. Enforcement standards actually don't even include children as they are currently. So, for example, Los Alamos applications for venting radioactivity are allowed to just calculate doses to adults for compliance, even though in some cases, including tritium, doses to infants could be much higher. Obviously, we need to revisit the radiobiological effectiveness factor. I've already mentioned my statement about tritium venting from Los Alamos that infants would have, by the calculation of my colleague Bernd Franke, who ran the model using the weather data from Los Alamos, from the area where the venting is proposed, that infant doses would be 3 times adult doses. And of course, as I've shown you, the risk to the infants is higher. And in my mind, you know, I'm obviously not a lawyer, but it seems like unequal protection to me. I leave that as a question for you as medical people to raise. So finally, a note on climate. Climate is an urgent problem. If you look at the history of nuclear, it's too slow and too costly. So there's at least an opportunity cost. So 30 reactors were planned after the nuclear renaissance, and only 2 were completed 8 years late, I think, and at more than double the cost. So basically, the amount of wind and solar built in the same time was many, many, many times what the 2 reactors in Georgia are going to produce. I have the actual number somewhere. I forgot to put it in the slide. I'll add it to the slide before I send it to you. And project failure rate is very high. It's a waste of money. I think the small modular reactor process is mostly, yeah, it is not going to materialize in the way that its proponents hope, to the loss of us all, besides all the problem of creating just plutonium just to boil water. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arjun. Sorry I wasn't at the beginning of the conference. I double booked myself. But Arjun, I'm Claire Gervais. I've been emailing you. I really appreciate your, just in-depth knowledge and conveying this questions. I put one question in the chat. So maybe we could start there. I wonder about ongoing studies of tritium exposure and health risk, and whether the EPA requires this for the communities where tritium is discharged into water bodies. Could you comment about that?
No, they don't require it. I'm not aware of ongoing studies. Thank you for asking that. In 1999, I wrote the BR7 committee, which I cited. Please study radionuclides that cross the placenta. I got signatures of more than 100 doctors, scientists, and members of activists, concerned members of the public, mostly from the US, from around the world, and sent it to the committee. I implored the committee to consider it. I did not sign a letter from many activists who said this committee has conflicts of interest. Overall, they did a pretty good job, especially on cancer. And they wrote an appendix about our letter, and they said, radionuclides that cross the placenta another time, not now. In 2021, there was another National Academies Committee. I wasn't going to say anything because they never listened to me. I've made some presentations. It's, but concerned people asked me that, Arjun, you must say something. So I did. I wrote a 10-page letter saying, I said this 25 years ago, so much support, so many thoughtful people, scientists, doctors. You haven't done it yet. Are you going to do it? It's not being done. It's a dangerous, the questions that I have raised are dangerous questions. They're also urgent and important questions. If we're going to expand and say nuclear power is the solution, and pressurized water reactors are routinely raining radioactivity on their neighbors, private water wells are not protected by the drinking water standard. There's no sampling. The whole thing, the short of it is, that's why I wrote a book about it.
Thank you. Joel
No.
has a question.
Thanks, Claire. Thanks, Dr. Makhijani, for your excellent presentation, and Claire, PSR WHN, for setting this up. This is a really important topic. I have a question sort of oriented towards like how we should be sort of spending our time in terms of advocacy. And one of I listened to your PBS special, and one of the things that I sort of took away from it is it seems like there are two different ways the conversation on nuclear happens. One is in this framing of like, in an ideal world, what should we do? And often that's framed as a debate between nuclear and renewables. And I think it seems very clear that obviously we should choose renewables over nuclear. And it seems like things get a little more complicated when we're dealing with what has tended to happen in practice, which it seems historically the choice has more often been made between nuclear and fossil fuels. So, many countries, did some early closures of their nuclear plants in the last 30 years. And generally that's increased use of coal and methane gas, worsening air pollution. There are a lot of peer-reviewed studies in respected journals estimating that early closures of those plants resulted in thousands of premature deaths in the countries where those closures occurred. There was a 2019 study estimating that Japan and Germany had reduced their coal use instead of nuclear use after Fukushima, that they could have prevented like 28,000 premature deaths from air pollution. And then there's a study in 2023 in Nature Energy saying that, basically arguing that if we shut down our nuclear fleet now, that it would result in 5,000 air pollution deaths a year. So I'm curious what you make of that data. And then I'm also curious, what your sort of position would be in terms of how we should spend our time on advocacy. I assume at a minimum, we should have much better regulations on our nuclear industry, and I'd be interested to hear about that. But I'm also interested to hear, what do you think we should be advocating for in terms of what to do with our nuclear fleet? Is it sort of across the board, close it as soon as possible, or is it sort of more nuanced of like only close a nuclear plant if we know for sure that's going to be replaced with nuclear?
There are no clean answers to your question. So my starting point is at the other end. Is nuclear power, should we be doing more nuclear power for the climate problem? Or should there be an end to the nuclear era? And then the question is when and how and what is its impact on CO2? So those are two different universes. The universe we're in politically is the first one. We should have, the big reactors are costly and take long, so we should have small reactors, which is backwards from how the economics of reactors works. But never mind, we're going to do it. It's 24/7. Nuclear proponents are generally not saying it should be 100% nuclear, because nuclear must operate at greater than 90% capacity factor to be effective and economical. To the extent that it can be economical, mostly it is not. Vogtle, for instance, the two reactors that were built, creating severe burdens on ratepayers in Georgia as we speak. So, and burdens on ratepayers for low income result in homelessness, health problems. So those are problems that are not being taken into account. So I didn't mention it. I should have actually. I've researched this question. About 5% of the people who get assistance for winter heating from the federal government, it's called LIHEAP, about 5% of those on average lose their homes every year because of conflicts between food, medicine, rent, utility bills. Very often, if your electricity gets cut off, you might also get evicted because it's part of your rental contract that you should have electricity. 5%, this is from the surveys done by the administrators of the assistance program. There are severe, the life expectancy of homeless people is 15 years less than the normal life expectancy. Why this is not part of the discussion of nuclear? And I told my friends in Georgia, you should make affordability a central element because you're making people homeless by doing this. Now, nuclear advocates don't talk about that. None of this is part of that calculation. Now, so I don't think new nuclear power plants are sensible. The record is there. The small modular reactor proposals range from really something that would make Wall Street very unhappy in a sensible way that they won't fund it, to delusional in the sense that you've done the same thing many times and then you do the same thing and you expect a different result. That kind of irrationality. So as a simple example, sodium-cooled reactors, the world has spent about $100 billion with a B trying to commercialize sodium-cooled reactors. And somehow the one that is proposed for Wyoming is magically going to be different. Maybe, some of them have worked well, but creating a fleet of them, you expect a lot of problems. That's the history. And it has been independently compiled by me and many others. So the history is over there, including, the most recent sodium-cooled reactors in the West, Japan and France, were shut down after operating less than 1 year. That was Monju in Japan and Superphénix in France with an average capacity factor of less than 7% over 14 years. Not the face of an economical electricity plant. That was a 1,200 megawatt plant, by the way, supposed to lead to this age of no more uranium mining. What to do with the existing reactors is an issue. There's a safety issue. So Germany, Exhibit A, right? They decided to accelerate. They decided to phase out after Chernobyl. So if you look at the French nuclear, so it's a sort of a impossible situation. If you look at the French nuclear agency's calculations of a severe accident in France. So basically you're going to lose the country. No more fine cheese, no more fine wine, no more Paris, no more, basically you've lost the country. Europe is a very densely populated place where food was severely impacted from a Chernobyl accident. So if you're Germany and you lost a lot of food and you have to dump food after Chernobyl and you've decided maybe this is not the way to go and you've done solar power better than anybody, even though their solar resources more like Alaska than similar to Washington State, coastal Seattle. It's a question of, a small risk of losing your country or emitting more CO2. And did they emit more CO2 because they shut down their nuclear? There is some of that. But a lot of it is because Eastern Germany was a coal mining region and a lot of pressures from coal miners, not different than this country, a lot of pressure in this country. It didn't succeed in the same way because it's more neoliberal than Germany in its political economic structure. I think that's a reasonable judgment. And they made that decision. France made the opposite decision. I'm not going to sit here and argue that one is better than the other. I think this is like telling a family to send as they did in Japan after Fukushima, that you can move back to the contaminated region and your children will get doses that 20 times the presently allowable limit. And I calculate the cancer risk to girls who would go to school in such a school over a 5-year period, it'd be about 1% excess cancer risk. But if your daughter got cancer, you would never know it was because of your decision or some other reason. It's 30 times more likely to be some other reason, but you would still curse yourself for making that decision. So that's the kind of risk we're talking about. And so we're in a world where these decisions are very difficult. At a first level, my statement about existing reactors has been that we should plan their phase out and accelerate renewables so that we should set overall carbon goals that we want to achieve and examine the phase out in that context. There are, of course, safety issues. I don't think our regulation is very alive to safety issues in the same way. Ironically, even though the French electricity company is 85% government owned and the regulator, of course, a government regulator, I think the French regulation is better better than any regulation that I know about, and I do know the French regulatory system pretty well because I've worked in France on these questions. I'm currently doing a nuclear waste project for a French stakeholder, official French stakeholder group, and already have done two. So, I mean, done with a group of researchers. And their regulation is quite rigorous, and I admire it. And we should be doing it. Leave aside giving you an example about it. Just I can illustrate that with facts. So at a first level, we should shut down plants that are clearly uneconomical relative to building, say, a new utility scale solar. We should make it more sensible to do utility scale solar by integrating agriculture like solar grazing with utility scale solar. I wrote a report about that actually. There are ranchers in Texas whose ranches are alive and economical today and functioning because they have wind energy. Same, I talked to the former Secretary of Agriculture in Minnesota, who happened to be the father of a colleague of mine, and interviewed him. And he said, around here in southwestern Minnesota, it's wind energy that's keeping the rural towns alive. So finding ways to accelerate the renewable energy transition, that's why I did hour by hour modeling. Is it possible with variable renewable sources? Electrons must go around second by second. It's a very severe constraint. It's not like traffic where you can have a traffic jam once in a while and it'll eventually work itself out. No, you'll have a breakdown if you have a traffic jam. And so I think the existing nuclear power plant problem is a very complicated problem. And part of the reason I don't dive into it, because I'm working on it, is that each case requires an immense amount of work. But you know, waking up closed nuclear power plants with giant subsidies and billions of dollars here and that's all ideological. We're not actually talking about climate. We're talking about pleasing constituencies. And you know, we're not, yeah, there are many dimensions in which our decarbonization roadmap is lacking. It's really not yet clearly even a dirt road with a proper direction. It has some overall fuzzy direction. Yes, we have to have decarbonized sources. And the final thing I'll say is nuclear advocates agree that wind and solar will be most of it. I mean, the amount of reactors you have to build to keep even 20% electricity in a growing electricity market, electric heating, transportation, all that, would be huge, far beyond what we have accomplished ever. And so if you have wind and solar that are variable, you need complementary resources that can respond very fast. By very fast, I mean seconds to minutes. Nuclear power doesn't respond in seconds to minutes. Now, they say some modular reactors will be designed to respond in seconds. Steam generation does not respond in seconds, period. And then if it is responsible, you're going from 90% capacity factor to 70% capacity factor. Now you got something that's costing you $150 a megawatt hour that's going to cost you more than $200 a megawatt hour. So I think we should calculate the life expectancy of people who are making homeless by doing these kinds of things. But, you know, even affordability and equity is not properly on the decarbonization map. And for the last dozen years, honestly, I haven't been working on the sort of anti side of the equation, but on the pro side of the equation. How do you make a transition happen that's just and without putting people out on the street and making it affordable and having some equitable access? And I've been a lot focused on those questions. Sorry to take so long, but I think I answered many questions because you asked many.
Thank you so much. There are a couple more questions, but I just
I'm
wanted to
happy
make
to
sure
stay.
everybody has, anybody can leave if they need to leave, but if people want to stay and ask a few more questions, I think we're open to that because I scheduled this
I
meeting
am.
to go on. So let's see, Alfred, you put a question in the chat. Are the plans to
I
restart?
haven't looked at the chat. I'm sorry.
That's okay. No, you're not responsible for that. That's us.
Okay.
We're keeping track of that for you, Arjun.
Thank you,
No problem.
Claire.
Yeah. Are the plans to restart closed reactors dangerous? Alfred asked that.
They could be, I don't know that we have an adequate regulatory system, Alfred, to deal with it. Because when you shut something down, you're not paying attention, you're not maintaining it, something may be rusting, something, it's not running. So take steam generators. Are your steam generators still in good shape? Will they leak when you start it up? So now you're relying on this for decarbonization. And you're putting, Palisades, what did they get? Some plant got a $1.5 billion loan to restart, didn't it? Wasn't it Palisades, Alfred? Frankly, I'm not keeping track of it and my friends have asked me, I said, I just can't. If somebody sent me a question about the tritium thing, are you keeping track of all of this stuff? And I said, yes, we asked the NRC to do all these things, but I can't keep track of it. I just, now IER is basically stripped down. As I grow older, I can't, the effort it takes to maintain a staff is very great. So I mean, it's a very complicated question. Overall, as a first approximation and not a studied approximation, I would say don't put money into it because solar is $1 a watt. Make it easier to build solar. The first thing we need to do with solar is to integrate resilience. We already had a terrible lesson in not having a resilient electricity system 10 days ago with Hurricane Helene. We're going to have another terrible lesson today in not having a resilient. What does a resilient energy system in a decarbonized world look like? It means you have to have distributed solar resources that are very secure, distributed storage. You have to have continuous service for essential loads. So you have to have essential loads with extremely secure supply so you don't lose your food and medicine, so people have a shelter to go to. We don't even have sensible procedures. I mean, I see pictures of these traffic jams going out of Tampa, and on the other side there are 2 whole highway lanes that have no traffic because nobody's going in. And I'm saying, why can't you put cones and have one additional lane going out? I don't know, but it's obviously not part of the emergency evacuation procedures. I mean, we do that here to manage traffic on Rock Creek Parkway every day. If make it one way sometimes and one way, 2 ways, or other times in the day. We haven't thought these things through. The amount of energy needed for resilience, maintaining critical loads continuously, hospitals, gas, you read, gas stations are out of gas. Well, even if they were not out of gas after the hurricane, they won't be able to give you gas because the pump isn't working because there's no electricity to the pump. So gas stations, grocery stores, shelters, hospitals, clinics, the mobile clinics, they all should be equipped to have continuous power. You can't do it with diesel because you're going to create pollution hell with the amount of essential loads there are in a modern economy. So, I mean, there are many dimensions in which decarbonization is lacking. The health dimension is very serious. We are not integrated the health dimension into decarbonization. That's, another debate. But I do hope that the doctors will advocate for some kind of pregnancy protection from radioactivity going away from this. And radionuclides across the placenta, both research as well as interim regulations. I have recommendations for interim regulations in my book. For tritium, I think I have suggested 50 times stronger than what they are today.
Thank you. I have one more question. I don't know if others do. Raise your hand or put it in the chat. But so the PBS recording, Michael Schellenberger said activists are preventing nuclear power plants from being built. You know, that actually PSR has that kind of power, for example. I'm laughing because it's like I just can't believe that that's true. That activists are preventing these power plants from being built. Do you think that's true, or do you think it's something else that's preventing us from adding more nuclear power in the US? Or elsewhere for that matter?
I think in 1985, February 11th issue, if I remember correctly, Forbes declared, this is close to an exact quote, Forbes declared US nuclear power to be the biggest managerial disaster in business history. That's Wall Street talking, not known as your neighborhood anti-nuclear activist. The nuclear renaissance, the pro-nuclear people went to Wall Street and said, you know, we need this for decarbonization. And Wall Street people said, we remember from the 1980s, please go away. And that's why the government gave all these loan guarantees and so on. That's where, you know, like, so I'm not a votary of neoliberal free markets because I don't think they've ever existed. That's a different story. I wrote a whole book about capitalism too. I like to write books. And it's called Manifesto for Global Democracy. It's online. You can download it. I do think it's relevant to these conversations. And especially if you look to the misery of Congo, where the uranium from the Manhattan Project came from. Lost my train of thought, actually. What was the question? You're on mute.
I'm
Claire.
muted. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, the Michael Schellenberger had claimed,
Yeah,
when he
Schellenberger.
debated you,
Yeah,
that
so
activists
he
are
debated
preventing
me.
nuclear power
Yeah.
plants from being
No,
built.
I wish, you know, I mean,
Yeah.
activists generally have been unsuccessful. Yours truly has been fairly successful, but only once in an activist mode and once in the mode of consultant to the Tennessee Valley Authority in the late 80s when they were building 14 nuclear reactors at once. And I was asked by the chairman to review their electricity planning from an efficiency point of view. And I did. And I said, if you build all of these reactors, you're not going to need at least 8 of them. You have nowhere to put the electricity. And so you're going to raise rates and have idle reactors and have spent all of this money and be deep in debt and you know, create a lot of economic damage for yourself and your ratepayers. And the chairman actually, it took him some years, S. David Freeman, great man, friend and mentor to me, passed on a few years ago, actually succeeded in canceling 8 of them. And they're still in debt from all the unnecessary construction. The resistance, you know, a lot of workers involved. It's not an easy thing to do, nor should it be, because a lot of livelihoods get tied up. A lot of people move, they're camping out near the work sites, et cetera, et cetera. So that was 8. And then I was involved with activists in Texas, getting rid of 2 of them. And I had arguably a role in one that was proposed for Idaho, but that was proposed by people who, yeah, let me not characterize it. Anyway, most of the nuclear renaissance projects died of their own. There was a lot of activism. I was, you know, part of some of the technical muscle that went into it. I fancy, but I think almost all of them died of their own economic weight. As the 4 reactors were started. So, you know, the anti-activists did not stop the North Carolina ones, and they did not stop the Georgia ones. And the 2 in North Carolina, Summer 2 and 3, were stopped after $9 billion in expenses. And, you know, the main result of that is paperwork and lawsuits. And, you know, electronic storage for data centers to, you know, store forever as to what South Carolina did. And I don't, you know, I think it's fanciful So, in a debate, you have to decide whether you're going to be always responding to things that are being said or kind of say things that need to be said to inform your audience. And I chose the latter. I would say that overall, not directly in terms of what we've demanded. So I have been an activist, I think, fair to say, on nuclear disarmament issues as well, a scientist, activist. And I think overall, the nuclear disarmament people have been more successful. The biggest success you, Amy, mentioned in the test ban treaty. I think you did, didn't you, Amy? Barry Commoner was a friend. He was part of the Tooth Fairy Project. He was a great scientist, and there were many others. And the activism in Europe and here in the early 80s didn't result directly in the freeze, but it did result in Nancy Reagan saying, "I don't want my husband to go down in history as a warmonger," and it resulted in some good things. The awareness of what nuclear war can do and loose nukes can do, and the non-proliferation activism resulted in Bush and Gorbachev dismantling tactical nuclear weapons at the end of the Cold War. So our successes overall on reducing numbers of nuclear weapons, not, I would say, necessarily in the direction of disarmament, because I don't think we've made progress on disarmament and abolition as a concept. Has been much greater than on nuclear power. In 1970, they said we'll have 1,000 nuclear power plants by the year 2000, and more than 200 were actually planned and started, but half of them fell away from their own economic weight because efficiency came to the fore. That was part of the work that Alfred mentioned that I did in the Energy Policy Project. It was a Ford Foundation Energy Policy Project that Dave led, and President Carter adopted his policy and CAFE standards and all that. And so basically the demand for electricity went down relative to economic growth from pre-73, and the reactors simply were not needed. And so that was the heart of the bad utility planning and bad use of ratepayer money, failure of chemical bank, little old ladies in their tennis shoes was a stereotypical image of the utility bondholder, very staid, in other words, something you could rely on. That all kind of went into the trash bin of history with the Whoops project in Washington State. That is what created the crisis. And then in the 1990s, cheap natural gas. That was the opinion of my former professor at Berkeley, Professor Pigford, who founded the MIT Nuclear Engineering Department. He was a proponent of nuclear power. And he said, basically, we don't have nuclear power in the 1990s because there's cheap gas. And that is, to a large extent, still the case. Now we have cheap solar and wind too, which was not the case at that time.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Is there anyone else that has questions for Arjun? I know we've gone way over time, but it's been
no problem.
pretty educational, and a lot of us actually on this call are not from PSR or know all this background. This is really enlightening, and it piques my interest, and I'm sure others, to learn more and to look at some of your books. It's very
Claire, I'll put in a few links in a slide before I send you the slides, and then you can circulate them.
Yes, I'm happy to do that. So great. Any other comments from Alfred or Amy? I don't think anybody on here is doing CME. Well, maybe Katie, but you probably got that link that's in there. Alfred, Amy, any comments from you?
I just want to say thanks again, Arjun, for sharing the message of the dangers that are inherent with nuclear waste and the impacts on health. And I hope that people will start to recognize that we're being sold a bill of goods when they're trying to say these SMRs are the solution and that sort of thing. So anyway, thanks again.
Yeah. I think the best remedy for this might be to reread the Lucy and Charlie Brown comics, you know, with the football. That might be the best kind of analogy for where we are with nuclear power again and again and again, falling to the same thing.
Well, I'd like to thank Arjun for his presentation. And one thing you always do for me, Arjun, is you bring in the concepts of justice and fairness and also a worldwide view over history. Because I think so often these questions get boiled down to some little fact or figure we're looking at, and we really need to look at a much bigger picture. So I appreciate you doing that for us.
Yeah, sure. You're welcome, Alfred. Good to see you again.
Yes. Thanks, everyone. This is being
Bye.
recorded, so we can pass on your information to others that weren't able to
Yeah.
make it. So, all right.
Thank you. Okay, bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye. Amy, I just want to make sure that you have the ability to stop the recording or
I was just looking to find the recording button and I'm not seeing it, but
I can reclaim and
here.
see if I can find it here too. I just
On yours?
reclaimed. I did. Just to see if I could find it. I don't see it either.
You took over the host.
It says
Again,
it's still recording.
Oh, here it is. All right. Stop recording. I got it.